The U.S. Capitol was on high alert this week after federal law enforcement received several extremist threats. Officials say there was online chatter by some QAnon conspiracy followers who believed Thursday, March 4th, was the day that former President Trump would come back into power. And while that did not happen, the QAnon movement continues to flourish among certain parts of society. A recent study by the Survey Center on American Life found that white evangelicals are more likely than other Republican factions to believe in conspiracies relating to the deep state, QAnon, and that Antifa was responsible for the Capitol attack. Joining me now is Colin Clarke. He's the Director of Policy and Research at the Soufan Group, an independent nonprofit research center focused on counterterrorism and violent extremism. Colin, you draw parallels between the QAnon movement and extremist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Explain.
Well, in their nascent stages, there's a similar amount of extremism and radicalism amongst the most hardcore. We don't expect QAnon to ever marshal the same resources and, build a caliphate on American soil. That's not what we're talking about here. But when we talk about lone actors, as part of this kind of broader ecosystem of a very extreme, belief system, we've seen acts of violence, starting with Pizzagate and several other acts of violence since. And if you just look at individuals involved in the January 6th Capitol insurrection, there was hordes of QAnon supporters among that group.
So what kind of dangers could this pose as it appears that the QAnon movement continues to grow?
Well, historically, religious terrorist groups have been, more lethal because they believe that they're conducting attacks and carrying out their duties in service of a greater good, right? They're serving a higher power. So as we see this blending, this infusion of evangelical Christianity with the QAnon movement, it has the effect of kind of adding longevity or durability to this conspiracy theory. We also have to think about countering this group. Evangelical Christianity is among the most influential sectors in our country. And so there's more of a chance that these people will be treated with kid gloves, so to speak, than actually combated in a way that we would look at other more hardcore terrorist groups.
Yeah, I mean, Colin, you're saying religious terrorist groups, and it's hard to imagine that isn't a bit of hyperbole when we're talking about evangelical Christians who believe in Q. Are you overstating the case, or is that really what you're seeing in your research?
This is more about the potential, what we see going forward. As we shift to a Biden administration, we're seeing a merger of QAnon folks with various other conspiracies, anti-vaxxers, as well as, very zealous anti-abortion activists. And as you know, we have a long history in this country of anti-abortion activists like Eric Robert Rudolph and others that have committed acts of terrorism in the name of anti-abortion. So this is more about looking forward, looking beyond the horizon to see what happens next. I certainly don't mean to suggest that evangelical Christianity is synonymous with terrorism. We're talking about, upwards of 100 million people in this country. That's not at all. But I'm talking about the most radicalized, most extreme, hardcore members of QAnon that have now gravitated toward and infused themselves with elements of what we call Christian nationalism.
Right. I'm glad for that clarification, because these are fringe elements within these groups. But why are certain groups more drawn to QAnon and these types of conspiracy theories?
Well, if you look at what we've experienced over the course of 2020, we had the COVID-19 pandemic. We had the George Floyd protests. We had easily the most contested election of our lifetimes. People are looking for a sense of control. And oftentimes in conspiracy theories, that access to information, feeling like individuals have exclusive access to certain information that no one else has, imbues them with a sense of control. And that's why we see people drawn to conspiracies like QAnon, like Stop the Steal, like all of these other aspects, that COVID is a hoax, that 5G is causing COVID. There's so many different splinters and derivations off of this initial conspiracy, again, these are embers of a fire that may then go on to ignite future fires.
It's interesting that you put it that way because, and it's also interesting that we're speaking right now because, as I mentioned, QAnon followers thought that former President Trump was going to be sworn back into office on Thursday. Clearly, that didn't happen. Do these predictions not coming true, does this dampen the enthusiasm of followers, or do people, as you're seeing it, continue to keep believing in Q, even though the group's theories continue to be disproven?
Yeah, I mean, again, we're talking about a minority of a minority. We're talking about, a very small percentage. But in a country of 330 million people in aggregate, that can be, a decent sized number. There's a bit of a, sunken cost. People feel like they've already devoted so much of their time and their energy to this that they don't want to believe that they've been duped. We have seen individuals that have kind of come to terms with that. They feel embarrassed. They feel ashamed. And I think, I'm a big believer in second and even third chances. We should be welcoming these people back. This QAnon conspiracy has destroyed communities. It's destroyed families and friendships. And we shouldn't, look at this as a moment to rub people's faces in, that they believed in this wild conspiracy. We should be welcoming them back into society and looking for ways to reintegrate them into those families and friendships that have been destroyed.
And one last question for you, Colin. How does that happen? How do you reach out to somebody who has been sucked down a rabbit hole and try and bring them back into a more honest understanding of the world?
Well, I think there's a couple of aspects. One is listening. It's not lecturing, right? It's not telling people, how could you ever believe this? How could you be so foolish? You did this wrong. It's having empathy and again, listening. And it's maybe going about things in our community. It's bringing things back to a local level, civil society organizations, things that we used to do as neighbors, but in this highly polarized, highly partisan environment, we've gotten away from. And letting these conversations flow organically. And again, these are families and friendships that have been torn apart. And I think, many people are hurting right now. Now is not the time to make people feel bad about choices that they might have had. The other aspect, quite honestly, and I think there's a role for the U.S. government here, is digital literacy. How do we kind of start teaching people what's real and what's not? How do we get at this very insidious aspect of disinformation, which has proliferated during the course of the pandemic, and teach people about data, about valid sources, and so on?
All right. Colin Clarke, thank you.